My name is Bill McKeever, and I'm the founder and director of Mormonism Research Ministry. We've been around since 1979, mainly trying to help Christians better understand the Mormon faith and hopefully help them in ways that they can more effectively dialogue with their Mormon friends. Unfortunately, a lot of Mormons, I don't think, really understand all the things that went on that led to Joseph Smith's death. All they see is a lot of what they perceive as just unjust persecution, the fact that he was jailed several times. But I find in my experience that a lot of Mormons really don't understand what were all the reasons for all these things. Why was he in jail for this? All they ever understood is that, well, he must have, just because of his righteousness and unrighteous people trying to silence him, that this is why he was incarcerated, when there's really more to the story than that. One of the things that I find very interesting about Mormonism is its tie with American history. And of course, studying this subject, I've been able to go and visit a lot of the very special sites, even sacred sites of Mormonism, sites that the Mormons consider to be very special to them. Of all the places that I've been, the one that I find to be the most intriguing would have to be the Carthage jail. In order to give you a better understanding of what this is all about, I probably should give you a little bit of history there. Joseph Smith was the mayor of Nauvoo, which was about 20 miles away on the banks of the Mississippi in Illinois, about 20 miles away from Nauvoo. And he was the mayor of the town, and of course he was a very controversial figure, and he was doing some things that had really upset a lot of very close followers, so much so that a lot of these followers started to fall away from him and were really upset with his lifestyle. 7 men got together to produce a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor. It's supposed to be a weekly newspaper. It ended up only coming out with 1 edition, and the reason is because Joseph Smith was just furious over this edition that was really attacking his abuse of power as mayor, and also was exposing the fact that Joseph Smith was practicing polygamy secretly. Smith had been lying about polygamy and actually had condemned polygamy outright, but he was practicing it, secretly, and these men knew this, and they were going to expose it.
How many wives did he have at this point?
How many wives Joseph Smith actually had is a matter of controversy, but some say that he had probably as many as 20, maybe 30 wives. And a lot of these wives, at least 10, Richard L. Bushman, a Mormon historian, admits that Joseph Smith had at least 10 wives that were simultaneously married to living men at the time. Todd Compton, in his book, In Sacred Loneliness, mentions that he thinks that there were 11 women that he was married to that were also married to living men at the time. Why this is important is because it seems to nullify the one argument that many Mormons raise when it comes to the subject of polygamy, and that the reason God instituted it in the first place was because he needed to raise up seed. Well, that doesn't even seem necessary if Joseph Smith is marrying married women, and we have no evidence whatsoever to show us that any of these husbands were either impotent or sterile. So that argument really doesn't hold. Joseph Smith is probably the best argument against that. It's found in Jacob chapter 2, verse 30 in the Book of Mormon. And plus, we really don't have any proof that Joseph Smith had children from any of these relationships. There's speculation, but there's really no concrete evidence.
How young were some of these women?
Some of these women were actually in their teens. Joseph Smith at this time, you have to understand, was in his 30s. Well, Joseph Smith, because of this behavior, as I mentioned, it caused quite a few of enemies, and so they tried to expose this through this newspaper. Joseph Smith was outraged by the things that they were saying, and he ordered the printing press destroyed, which it was. And in order to protect himself and his church from the outcry from the locals, he calls the Nauvoo Legion, which was a standing army. Some estimate that there could have been as many as 5,000 men in this army. But he calls his Nauvoo Legion into effect and declares martial law. Well, Joseph Smith is eventually ordered by the governor to meet in Carthage and to get this matter straightened out. Governor Thomas Ford was involved at the time. But Joseph Smith, knowing that he had had so many enemies that really hated him, and there was threats against his life, that instead of going to Carthage, Joseph is going to flee the area. He crosses the Mississippi with his brother Hiram, and he is over near a town called Montrose, Iowa, which is directly across the river from Nauvoo. members in the church talk Emma, his wife, into writing a letter to encourage Joseph Smith to return. And in the letter, it purportedly has a comment in there that refers to Joseph Smith as being a coward for leaving his church behind. Joseph Smith makes this romantic comment that, that if his life isn't worth anything to his friends, that it's not worth anything to him, and so he's going to go back to Illinois and he's going to face these charges, knowing full well that, at least in the way history is written now, that he's probably not going to live. Before he leaves Nauvoo, he makes the comment that he is going as a lamb led to the slaughter, this messianic connection that I have often heard going to Carthage jail and going through various tours. You hear this messianic connection made many times regarding Joseph Smith. In fact, you hear comments such as the Carthage jail is like the Mormon Calvary, where Jesus shed his blood for the Christian church on Mount Calvary. Joseph Smith shed his blood for the Mormon church in Carthage. Joseph Smith ends up going to Carthage, Illinois, and he is going to stay at a hotel. He's eventually confronted by a constable by the name of Bettesworth. And he learns through this constable that now the charge, instead of being riot, as it was originally, is now treason, apparently connected with him declaring martial law. So now the charges have become very serious. So Smith is incarcerated at the Carthage jail, and it was at the Carthage jail that he is waiting for this to all be settled. And during that time, he's allowed to visit with friends, and he is in the jail cell. At the end, he's in the jail cell with his brother Hiram, another gentleman by the name of John Taylor, who would later become the third president of the Mormon Church, and also a man by the name of Willard Richards. While they are waiting in the jail, he is visited by a man by the name of Cyrus Wheelock. Now, there's an interesting story about all this. Joseph Smith received this smuggled pistol from Cyrus Wheelock. If you were to ever take the tour at Carthage jail, they never mention the smuggled pistol. I've been there several times. Never do the tour guides volunteer the information regarding the smuggled pistols that Joseph Smith and his brother had. But it all goes back to this man by the name of Cyrus Wheelock. Well, one of the times when I was going through the tour guide again left that part of the story out. So when he opened up for questions and answers, I raised my hand and I asked about the smuggled pistol. And I actually quoted from the documentary History of the Church, Volume 7, where it talks about this, page 101 to 103. And when I mentioned that book to the tour guide, he said, well, you have to be careful about the books that you read, because there's a lot of erroneous material out there. And I went, but wait a minute, the documentary History of the Church, that's your book. That's put out by the Mormon Church. This is where I'm getting that story. And he goes, oh, the documentary History of the Church. He said, yeah, that's a good book. That's a good book. And he said, well, I'll tell you about the smuggled pistol. And he starts to tell me this elaborate story of how Cyrus Wheelock actually went up to the guard who was guarding the entrance to the jail and opened up his coat and said, I have a gun here and I've come here to kill Joseph Smith. And the guard lets him in. Now, I've never heard this story before. I don't know where this guy's getting this story. And this is the first time I'm hearing it. And this is just intriguing to me. And I'm thinking about this. If we were to transport ourselves back into that time period and imagine here we are in 1844, it's June 1844, and a man comes up to a guard and says, I have a gun and I'm going to go inside and I'm going to kill the prisoner that you're supposed to be guarding, and you let him in. Okay, that sounds pretty strange to begin with, but then the guy went on to tell us, the tour guide went on to say that, eventually the guard was relieved and a new guard came on duty. Now think about this. You just let a guy go into a jail with a gun to assassinate your prisoner, and he hasn't come out yet. Okay? And you haven't heard a gun go off. So you leave your post and allow someone new to come and take your place, and you don't look into this? I mean, the story is just so far-fetched. But this man firmly believed that this is what happened. Basically, Cyrus Wheelock leaves the gun with Smith, and there's another derringer that's involved that is given to Hiram, Joseph Smith's brother. And as they were there in the jail, they were waiting, for this thing to all be settled. And there's another section in Joseph Smith's story where he talks about how they were, had a very heavy spirit. I mean, it was probably a very depressing time for them because they know the situation does not look very good for them. And so they order some wine to be brought to the jail. And Smith admits that this wine was not for sacrament purposes, but that it was to relieve their spirits, and so it was actually meant to, I guess, to be somewhat intoxicating, to make them feel better, which is kind of odd because Mormons aren't supposed to drink alcoholic beverages, but yet it seems perfectly okay for Joseph Smith to do that. Eventually, the jail is approached by a mob. How many are in the mob, we really don't know. Again, the numbers fluctuate. Some say as many as 200 people, were involved in this mob. And a group of men go up the stairs towards the upstairs room where Joseph Smith was being held, and they're rushing the door. Now, you have to understand the jail cell that Joseph Smith was in did not have bars on it. It had merely a door, and the door didn't even latch. It was warped, and the lock didn't really even work. So I remember the first time that I went to the Carthage jail was back in the 1980s, and we had a tour guide by the name of Elder Salt from Salt Lake City. I mean, it's hard to forget that name. And I remember Elder Salt telling us the story of how the only defense that Joseph Smith and the others that were in the jail cell with him had was by holding themselves against the door and fighting off their attackers with their walking sticks. And he repeats this, 3 times. The only defense they had was by holding themselves against the door and fighting off their attackers with their walking sticks. And after telling this very emotional story, and we were the only non-Mormons there, and the rest of the people in there were all a group from BYU. That it was a busload of BYU students that had just been dropped off. And so while he tells this story and he bears his testimony to the truthfulness of it, and of course there's this resounding amen, and then he says, "Are there any questions?" So I raised my hand, and I says, "You'd mentioned 3 times that the only defense that Joseph Smith and the others had was by holding themselves against the door and fighting off their attackers with their walking sticks." I said, "But I remember reading in Volume 7, page 101 to 103 of the Documentary History of the Church that Joseph Smith had a smuggled pistol, and that he used that pistol to shoot 3 people, 2 of whom died." And it was interesting because you could hear, it was like the proverbial tabernacle tour. You could hear a pin drop. It was dead silence. And I'll never forget, Elder Salt, the tour guide, put his arms behind his back. He rocked on his heels, looking at the floor, and he said, "Yes, there was a gun." And he proceeded to also mention the Derringer that Hiram had that I did not bring up. It made me wonder, this man gave this emphatic story that the only defense Joseph Smith had and the others in the jail was by holding themselves against the door, fighting off their attackers with their walking sticks. Yet all the time, this man knew he had a smuggled pistol. He didn't deny the fact that Joseph Smith fired the pistol, but he did say, "We don't know where the bullets went." To which I said, "Well, John Taylor seemed to know. He said that he shot 3 people, 2 of whom died. Obviously, we know at least 3 of the bullets went into somebody." Of course, he didn't really want to readily admit to that part of the story, but he did know that there was a gun. But at the same time, he kept insisting that the only defense was holding themselves against the door, which now we know, and he was admitting, was not the case. That I found very disconcerting. Every time I go and I visit the Carthage jail, like I say, I've never heard them bring up the gun. One time I asked one of our tour guides, "Wasn't there a smuggled pistol?" She said, "Well, it wasn't smuggled, it was brought in." What does that mean? Was it legal at that time to bring guns in to prisoners? I mean, come on, this is silly. What kind of an answer is that? But they will not tell you anything about this. The last time I went to Carthage, we had a sister missionary, and she also failed to mention the gun. I had a long discussion with her afterwards, and she knew all about it. She knew all about the gun. She probably had done more homework on the story than I've seen many tour guides at Carthage jail. But yet, she wasn't about to divulge that part of the story, mainly because it didn't make Joseph Smith look very heroic, I guess. The fact is, Smith did have a gun. According to John Taylor, he shot 3 people, 2 of whom died. John Taylor never changed his story. He stuck with that story, as far as I know, till the day he died. You'll still find it written in various accounts. The Comprehensive History of the Church, I think, also mentions this account, as well as the Documentary History of the Church. After Joseph Smith the way we get to that part of him using the gun is while they are holding themselves against the door, which they really did do. So the tour guide, Elder Salt, was correct. They were holding themselves against the door. There's no doubt about it. But while they're doing that, one of the people attacking the jail fires a shot through the door. The bullet penetrates Hiram's face about near the bridge of the nose. And Joseph Smith, or Hiram Smith, falls back. And according to the account, he makes some statement like, "I am a dead man." Now, first of all, he's just got a musket ball into his brain. I mean, is he really going to be thinking of words like, "I am a dead man"? Is this really what happened, or is this, again, just Mormon folklore? The way the story goes, Joseph Smith goes to the aid of his fallen brother and says something to the effect, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram." Did Joseph Smith really say that? It sounds a little cheesy to me. I mean, it's not something that I would probably think if it was my brother. But nonetheless, he sees his brother who's dying here, who's probably dead at the time. And so at that time, according to John Taylor's account, Joseph Smith grabs the pistol that's in his pants pocket, and he sticks his arm through the door and fires off these 3 rounds. And so this is where he shoots them. Joseph Smith afterwards realizes that this is pretty much a lost cause, so he's going to try to escape going out the window. Now you have to understand, this jail is pretty thick. You know, I forget exactly how thick the walls are, but you have to basically go up on a ledge to get to the window. And when he goes to the window, there's a mob. Part of the mob is waiting outside for him, and they're firing through the glass. And Smith is hit by the bullets. I think he was hit 4 times. Once in the chest, a couple times in the back, and I can't remember where the other bullet went. But nonetheless, he's fired upon by the mob outside, and he falls out the window, and he dies. What's interesting about all this is when I was at the Carthage jail the first time, back in the 1980s, I knew that there was a blood stain that was on the floor. And I knew also that there used to be a glass frame that covered the blood stain. I knew this for a fact because I'd actually seen pictures of it, and we have a picture of it on our website. I learned this through some friends of ours, of my wife and I, who had gone to the Carthage jail back in the 60s when this frame was still in place. And they were told at the time that it was covering the blood of Joseph Smith. Okay. Now, anybody who knows the history of this story would know that that could not have been the blood of Joseph Smith. The blood happened to be around 6 or 7 feet away from the door, about the length of a man. So when you think about it, that was probably the blood of Hiram that was in the wood and wouldn't come out. The blood soaked into I think the floor was made of an oak, and so it stained the floor. When I went and asked about the blood stain, there was no frame on the ground to even know where it was, but Elder Salt knew about it, and he pointed it out to me. It happened to be in between 2 benches, so you would have walked right on top of it without even knowing it was there. And he pointed it out to me and told me that that was the sacred blood of Hiram. That would make more sense, that would be Hiram's blood, because if he was shot near the door and he fell back, that's probably about where his head would have been. Joseph Smith, it could not have been his blood because he was shot over by the window. There's no way that much blood would get over, so many feet away. It was impossible. It wouldn't have happened. But that was the story that I was given. Now you don't even know about the blood stain. They don't even talk about the blood stain. But I had an interesting talk with a sister missionary this last time, and she knew about the blood stain. She told me, and I haven't verified the story, but she told me that it was Spencer Kimball, President Spencer Kimball, who tried to make a concerted effort to get rid of the blood stain. But it's still there. You can still faintly see the outline of the blood stain in the ground, in the floor, but they just don't talk about it. But it's interesting that there's a lot of things about this story that failed to get into the tour. And I think one of the reasons is because it would show Joseph Smith as being a man just like the rest of us, reacting in a very normal way, a defensive way, hardly acting in the way that we would probably think of first century martyrs who willingly went to their deaths, not volunteering. You didn't volunteer to be a martyr in the early church. But when you were going to be martyred, you went realizing that you were going to die for the cause of Christ. And we don't see that with Joseph Smith. We see him instead going out in a gun battle We see him trying very hard to escape his assassins. And I guess technically, the Mormons might try to say, well, yes, he still basically died for his cause because he wouldn't have been there had it not been for all the things that he stood for. Okay, perhaps. But I think when they use the word martyr so flippantly, I think they actually detract, at least in my mind, from the ancient Christians, for instance, who in my mind went willingly for their faith in Christ. I don't see that with Joseph Smith. I don't see him going willingly like the first century Christians. The romanticizing of Joseph Smith's death is really illustrated, I think, with this film, Joseph Smith, Prophet of the Restoration, that is currently being shown downtown in the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. It's supposed to be an accurate account of Joseph Smith's life during the Nauvoo period, and it also shows his death at Carthage. But what's interesting is after Hiram is shot, and he's laying there in Joseph Smith's arm in this very dramatic scene, instead of Joseph Smith grabbing the smuggled pistol that he had in his pocket, which is what history tells us he did, Joseph Smith turns towards the window. And as you see bullets flying through the glass of this window, you see the camera angle going towards the window, and it's supposed to be through the eyes of Joseph Smith, goes up towards the window, and as it crashes through the window, instead of falling to the ground, the camera angle goes up in the air as if in an ascension. And what's interesting is then it kind of fades to black, and then you see Joseph Smith, looking up into the sky with the words, "O Lord, my God." Now this is misleading. It's not that Joseph Smith didn't say that, because he most certainly did, but he certainly didn't say it the way the film portrays. I have a book here by Richard L. Bushman. It's a biography of Joseph Smith called Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. And what I find intriguing about this book is that Richard Bushman is a Mormon, a faithful Mormon. He admits he's a faithful Mormon at the very beginning of the book. And he describes what happened in the final moments of Joseph Smith's life. Let me read to you what it says on page 550. It says, Hiram was the first to fall. A ball through the door struck him on the left side of the nose, throwing him to the floor. 3 more balls entered his thigh, torso, and shin, killing him. John Taylor was hit in the thigh and fell against the windowsill, breaking his watch. Crawling toward the bed, he was struck again in the hip. Joseph pulled the trigger. See, he's admitting to the gun. Joseph pulled the trigger 6 times into the hail, dropped the pistol on the floor, and sprang to the window. With one leg over the sill, he raised his arms in the Masonic sign of distress. A ball from the doorway struck his hip, and a shot from the outside entered his chest. Another hit under the heart, and a fourth his collarbone. He fell outward, crying, "O Lord, my God." Hardly the calm method that it's portrayed in the film. Landing on his left side, he struggled to sit up against the curb of a well and died within seconds. Richards raised his head above the sill far enough to see that Joseph was dead, and then turned to help John Taylor. Taylor's watch had stopped at 16 minutes past 5. What's so significant about this phrase, "O Lord my God," is that there are Mormon historians who admit that what Joseph Smith was trying to do was give the Masonic signal of distress. And, it's clearly, this is a phrase. There's a phrase in Masonry that when you're in trouble, that you say something to the effect, "O Lord my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" And that Smith was trying to give this signal of distress, but was shot before he was able to give all of it. Basically, "Is there no help for the widow's son" refers to Hiram Abiff, who is a familiar figure in Masonry. And Joseph Smith was a Mason. He became a Mason in 1842, and not long after becoming a Mason, he incorporates the Mormon endowment ceremony. So he was familiar with this. But what's interesting is voice inflection is very important. Context is very important. I have a real hard time believing that Joseph Smith just calmly said, "O Lord, my God." I don't think the situation called for such a calm response. I think he was probably screaming at the top of his lungs, hoping that somebody would come to his rescue, and unfortunately for him, they didn't. I think the fact that the Mormon Church has to leave out so much important information about Joseph Smith tells us not only a lot about him, but it tells us a lot about the church itself. Do you really want to place your trust in a man whose character has to be doctored, who has to be airbrushed, if you will? Do you really want to place your trust in a church that has to do that, that feels compelled to do that? Trust is a big thing. As a Christian, I have no problem trusting completely in the work and the promises of Jesus Christ. But I'll tell you, when it comes to Joseph Smith, I can't have that same kind of trust. This man is not deserving of my trust. If Joseph Smith lived today the way he lived back then, I don't think even many Mormons would want to place their trust in him.